afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, CDF, for inviting me to be here today. It is my pleasure, as always. So I'm going to talk about the gluten-free diet today, which a few of you might be following, perhaps. I know there will be a lot of questions raised today about, how much can we trust that our food supply is gluten-free? How much is enough when it comes to the gluten-free diet? And I just want to say that I think everyone is doing their best who has celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. There's a lot that we don't know about the gluten-free diet that has not been studied. So I might have a few questions raised today. But what we do know, I'm going to help reassure you. So when talking about the gluten-free diet, we have to start with the basics. I think that reading food labels is the most important part of following a gluten-free diet, and it's almost like a superpower. If you can read a food label, you can really navigate every situation. And I am going to come up here. Can you hear me? Yes. All right, so within food labels, we have gluten-free symbols. We have ingredients lists and allergen labels, and then we also have allergen advisory statements. Food labels is also going to apply to supplements. So dietary supplements like vitamins, minerals, protein powders are held to the same standards as food. Alcohol and food service are going to be two slightly different topics. And then at the very end, I want to talk about some practical advice that I give to my patients, some saves to navigating the world as you're gluten-free. Okay, so what does the gluten-free label mean? It means no wheat, barley, or rye. Per the FDA, it can also mean that there are no ingredients made from these grains unless that ingredient is processed to remove gluten. So before it's added to a food product, it has to be gluten-free. This, for example, is why wheat starch is allowed in gluten-free products as long as it is processed and can be proven to be gluten-free. A food can be labeled gluten-free if it's naturally gluten-free, but in any of these situations, the unavoidable cross-contamination of the product with gluten must be less than 20 parts per million. So the gluten-free label is also equal to a label that says free of gluten, no gluten, or without gluten. I haven't seen many of those labels. Anyone here seen this? No? What I have seen a lot of is these. So these do not mean gluten-free. They have no legal jurisdiction. No gluten-containing ingredients. This is maybe the more popular one that I see at a really popular local grocery store. Gluten removed or gluten neutralized, that's new fancy terminology, and then gluten friendly. So know that these are probably a manufacturer's purposeful decision to not label their food gluten-free. How many of you in here only eat foods that have a symbol, like certified gluten-free, that something in a circle? They're pretty much all circle symbols. Okay. How many of you are open to kind of eating any food as long as it doesn't seem to contain wheat, barley, or rye? Okay, so we have a few that did not answer. So we have one study examining this question back in 2014 that compared foods that are labeled gluten-free with no certification to foods that are certified gluten-free by any number of organizations. And there was not a very significant difference. So less than 5 parts per million is essentially the lowest that we can test a food for gluten with our current testing methods. And so being labeled gluten-free, the vast majority of them were less than 5 parts per million, no detectable gluten. Whereas only 5% and 4% of either product, either type of food product, had accidentally, incidentally, over 20 parts per million gluten. And I suspect that as time has gone on, let's see, it's been 4 years since then, I suspect that they're doing even better. So, in my opinion, you do not need to only choose certified gluten-free foods. So it's very helpful to know how to read food labels for the ingredients wheat, barley, and rye. So first we have to start with reading the ingredient list, and that's going to be this long kind of list of foods and chemicals. Within the ingredient list, foods basically, companies have to declare if there is wheat, either in the ingredients list or in the allergy contained statement. So at the bottom of the ingredient list is usually a contains statement. If there's no contained statement, it's usually not containing any allergens. Okay, so this is for wheat. Eliminating Oh, I see what happened. Okay, that's not going to help. The tape came off. Okay, so this takes wheat off the bat. If you don't see wheat anywhere in the label, that's one less thing to worry about. When it comes to barley, however, there's no law that barley has to be declared as an allergen in food products regulated by the FDA. So these 4 ingredients are the main ones to look for that can be made from barley and still have some residual gluten content. And they are not allowed in products that are labeled gluten-free in the United States because, by definition, they come from barley. Has anyone traveled outside of the US and seen malt in a gluten-free food? No? Oh, okay. It is allowed in some parts in Europe, so the debate continues. I remember when I was first diagnosed, I got maybe a list that was 2 pages long of ingredients to look out for, and really with my patients, I've narrowed it down to these 4 and just a couple others. Okay, last is rye, and thankfully, rye doesn't go by any other name. So it's very easy to spot. It would not be in the contained statement because it does not have to be declared. However, it would be somewhere in the ingredients label. Okay, so what if it's not labeled gluten-free, but it doesn't contain wheat, barley, or rye? How do you decide whether or not to eat it? Curious, if I show of hands, who feels comfortable eating like a yogurt that's not labeled gluten-free? Okay, how about a water? Okay. How about a cereal? Good job, okay. So from this study in 2015, individuals at the FDA compared different categories of food that were either labeled gluten-free or not labeled gluten-free. And what I've listed here is not all the foods that they tested, but these are the categories that had the highest rate of accidental or incidental gluten content. So with foods labeled gluten-free, kind of all were relatively very low risk, 0 to less than 5%. For those that were not labeled gluten-free, the products that are at high risk of containing gluten are grains, seeds, nuts, and legumes. However, this category included oat flour, which, duh. Breakfast cereals, which many breakfast cereals contain oats, snack foods, and granola bars and energy bars, which often contain oats. So kind of one of the biggest lessons learned from this is if it contains oats and it's not labeled gluten-free, don't eat it. If it is a baked good or a cereal or a granola bar, even if it doesn't contain oats, maybe choose one that's labeled gluten-free. Okay, and now we get to allergen advisory statements. These are the may contain or made on shared equipment or made in a shared facility or made down the block. These are the bane of my existence. Anyone else feel that way? Yeah. Great. So these also have no legal definition, no regulation. So we don't really know why manufacturers choose to put them on labels and why they don't. And in fact, if we look at the data, recently from 2016 to 2018, there were several hundred products surveyed that either had an allergen advisory statement for wheat or did not have an advisory statement. And so remember back to that 5 parts per million, that's kind of the lowest amount of gluten that we can detect in a food. The foods that did not have an advisory statement were more likely to contain incidental gluten. So nobody warned the consumer that, oh, this food might be more likely to contain gluten. And then if we look at those containing more than 20 parts per million, which would not be in compliance with the FDA definition, the foods without an advisory statement were actually less likely to contain gluten than those that did have an advisory statement. So what we're learning from this is that as far as we know, these mean nothing, okay? You are just as likely to get glutened accidentally from something that gives you the warning than something that doesn't. What's most important is that you choose something that is labeled gluten-free. Doesn't have to have a certification. It should just be labeled gluten-free. Okay, so that was food and supplements. However, there are a few other things that we put in our body that are not subject to these rules. Meat, seafood, poultry, and eggs. Did anyone realize that they don't have to follow that rule? Okay, good. You're very well educated. Alcohol, which doesn't have to declare any ingredients, actually. And medications, and then food service. So how do we navigate these? When it comes to meat, seafood, poultry, and eggs, they are regulated by a different agency. However, more than 90% of them do follow the FDA rules. So if you see, I don't know, let's say you're buying a steak that's coated in black pepper and lemon, I don't know. You're buying something that's pre-seasoned and you look at the ingredients label. If it said contains egg and not contains wheat, there's no hidden wheat. It's following the FDA guidance. When I do advise people to double check is when there is no contained statement and it is kind of a meat ingredient that has more than one ingredient. And these 3 ingredients are more likely to be made from wheat starch and still contain gluten. However, they could be made from rice starch or corn starch or tapioca starch. So it just means asking a question or choosing a different similar product. Okay, now we're on to the fun one. So another agency that regulates alcohol has decided to kind of fall in line with the FDA and says that an alcohol cannot be labeled gluten-free if it comes from an ingredient from wheat, barley, or rye. So you might notice that some vodkas are labeled gluten-free. They can only be labeled gluten-free if they came from a non-gluten source like potato. However, we know that other alcohol is safe for those with celiac disease because of the distillation process. So distilled liquor, regardless of the source, is safe to consume for someone with celiac disease. Alcohol that we know is not safe for celiacs, or we suspect is not safe, research is still pending, is gluten removed or crafted to remove gluten. Typically, this is a fermented product, like a beer that's made from barley malt or rye, and they're insisting that the final product contains no gluten because of the fermentation process. However, we know that when you ferment something, it chops the proteins up real small. That doesn't mean that they don't affect the gut. All right, and lastly, food service, which food service establishments are regulated by local agencies, so it's a lot less regulated than packaged foods, and I think this is probably where a lot of us are running into problems with the higher than recommended incidental gluten intake. So some tips that I have for eating out, eating at restaurants, weddings, etc. Choose dedicated or nearly dedicated facilities as much as possible. A nearly dedicated facility, I mean the only thing in the entire restaurant that contains gluten is the tortilla. I feel a lot safer there than a pizza parlor where there's lots of loose flour everywhere. However, there's not much research on this topic. So it's even hard for me to say this is based on research, and I know for sure that these tips are going to help keep you safe. I recommend speaking with a chef or a manager rather than a cashier or waiter, someone who has a higher investment in the company is often more willing to find out the answer to your question than to pretend to know the answer. Calling ahead during off-peak hours is also very helpful. Has anyone gone to a restaurant hoping that that one dish is gluten-free only to find out at the table, no, sorry, it's not, and you're trying not to cry? Or you're deciding, well, do I walk out now? Or do I have a stupid salad with no dressing? So calling ahead during off-peak hours can be a really great way to avoid that emotional reaction that is completely normal for all of us to have when trying to decide if we can eat something that sounds good to eat. You can also ask to put a notification in the reservation notes. And then when I'm at the restaurant, I tend to ask the waiter or the chef or the manager, how do you prevent cross-contact with gluten in your kitchen? I see that you're saying this dish is gluten-free, whether it's on a printed menu or you're assuring that to me kind of verbally, but how do you prevent cross-contact? I used to maybe ask 20 or so questions, and that feels like a lot, right? Also when maybe waiters don't know the answer to those questions. So I like to ask them to prove it to me and to tell me if they have any policies in place that do help keep my food safe. So this is a summary of risk assessment in navigating the world on a gluten-free diet. So the high risk column includes oats, gluten-removed beer, restaurants, and supplements. And let me clarify. It doesn't mean that these all contain gluten. It means we need to make sure that these are labeled gluten-free and are safely gluten-free. So these are the most likely to be contaminated. Those at low risk include medications, which I didn't spend much time on today because actually that's how much I think of it. Meat, poultry, eggs, and seafood, because so many manufacturers do follow the allergen labeling. And then children's toys like Play-Doh, let me clarify that as well. If you know it's going in the mouth, it's high risk. If it's something that's just played with and your child is old enough to kind of follow direction and not put their hands in their mouth, it's going to be a lower risk. At no risk are cosmetics that are topical. We cannot absorb gluten through our skin. And stamps and envelopes. Is that one still circulating in the community? I don't know where that came from. Okay, so living gluten-free to live. If you're at a restaurant that you feel like you're really having a communication breakdown with the staff, but you're starving, you really need to eat something, here are some safer, kind of low-risk options. Typically a salad that's just greens and vegetables, and usually beans, as long as they're not flavored beans. And then oil and vinegar. That can be a satisfying meal that contains carbohydrate with the beans. A baked potato with cheese can also be very satisfying. And eggs over easy if you have any question about, did they mix pancake batter into my eggs? Just ask for them whole. When you're at a party or a friend's home or on the road, somewhere where maybe you're not prepared with snacks, but you find yourself hungry, most people have these foods around. Popcorn, fruit, cheese, nuts, hard-boiled eggs, and corn tortilla chips or potato chips. You would need to read the ingredients, but thankfully I've taught you how to do that. Okay, so a couple other tips that I give my patients to enhance the nutritional quality of their gluten-free diet is somewhat similar to what Dr. Crow said, to choose naturally gluten-free foods as much as possible. And thankfully, I think there are a lot of products available, processed products that are gluten-free, that are made with kind of more nutrient-dense foods, such as almonds or other nut flours. Bean pastas, bean and lentil pasta. Has anyone had that? It's pretty good. Whole grains such as quinoa, millet, teff, sorghum, or black and red rice. These are just going to have a higher vitamin and mineral content than our typical cornstarch, rice starch, or potato starch. So I'd always recommend having as many variety of kind of products in the pantry. So if the cereal that you love is made of rice, make the pasta that you routinely eat, make from quinoa or lentils. Maybe make baked goods from almond flour. Just mix it up so that your entire life is not just rice flour. Ground flax seeds, chia seeds, pumpkin seeds, and sunflower seeds are also a really easy way to add nutritional value to your maybe less than very nutritious pancake mix, or I routinely add chia seeds to my blueberry pancakes, and I think they're delicious. And then root vegetables are also going to be higher in nutritional value. Potatoes, especially with the skin, whether they're sweet potato, yams, white potatoes, squashes, beets, and turnips. So come visit me at UCLA. We have offices in Santa Monica and Westwood. And I think that we're going to have a duel going on quite soon with USC, because I heard a lot of fighting words mentioned today. So thank you very much.